Let me talk about my work. I hope that you, oh no, there we go. I hope that this can be the start of a really, like Dr. Rainey said, a productive collaboration and partnership. So I'll just start by saying I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And I'll jump right in. So today I'm just going to be briefly discussing the purpose and design of just-in-time adaptive interventions, which I'll probably interchangeably refer to as JITAIs and JITAIs because I can't seem to decide what I like to call them. And I'll be using an example from my prior work, developing a JITAI for dietary adherence, to really illustrate and contextualize the design and development process of what designing these tools could look like. And then I'll end with a description of my current microrandomized trial, which is in process. And these are specific research designs meant to foster empirically supported just-in-time intervention development. So before I dive in, I do want to say a disclaimer in that, I'm hoping to use my work to date to illustrate one path towards developing a JITAI that follows what you'll see as a very flexible design framework. But I'm certainly not endorsing this as the only linear way to develop an adaptive intervention. And if this is something that interests you or something that you're already doing, your research agenda could look much different from what I present here, depending on what you know about your topic, your research questions, and emerging methodologies that make sense for you to be using. So everything with a grain of salt. So to start off with just-in-time interventions, for those of you who are new to the topic, so the overarching goal of just-in-time interventions is to be delivering support in moments of need. They accomplish that by adapting the provision of support in a way that changes as the individual and their environment changes. And going along with this, they avoid delivering support when it's not needed or even maybe when it would be contraindicated to be delivering it. So we can operationalize just-in-time support by two overlapping constructs. The first is a state of vulnerability. So on the left there, thinking about when someone might be susceptible to engaging in a negative health outcome. Or sometimes I also like to call this opportunity, which is much more positive, which is a time where someone could be engaging in positive health behavior changes. We also have on the right side here a state of receptivity. So this can also be considered availability. So a condition where the person can receive, process, and use the support provided. So for example, we don't want to be delivering guided meditation when someone's driving. That would be considered a time of unavailability for most things. So these states of vulnerability and receptivity are just that, they're states, they're ever changing. And this is one of the reasons why JITAIs have really sort of taken hold as ubiquitous computing, like smartphones and sensors, have really come into the forefront here. They're great for developing and implementing just-in-time interventions. So when we identify that sweet spot, one of the important questions that we have to ask ourselves is, well, what intervention do we deliver? And frankly, identifying states of vulnerability and states of receptivity are research questions in and of themselves. But once we get there, what intervention do we deliver? And the brief but irritating answer is that it probably depends. So our goal here is to be individualizing support based on ongoing assessment of the individual state and ecological context. And this is especially useful, which is all why we're here today, for improving health and mental health, where many decisions that a person makes to engage in healthy behaviors or abstain from unhealthy behaviors are based on these moment-to-moment states for the most part. So there are many factors to account for while building a just-in-time intervention, and they can really range in complexity. When we think about developing technology-based interventions more broadly, and JITAIs are no exception, there are a ton of time and effort and money to develop, or they can be. And so you want to avoid putting a lot of work into developing a very cool looking JITAI and doing a really nicely designed RCT, only to find out that it doesn't work. And not only does it not work, but we have no idea why. So how do we build effective just-in-time interventions? So today what I'll be doing is I'll be walking through the design elements that guide the development of a just-in-time intervention. all JITAIs should have these core elements to them to ensure that they're cleanly designed and that they target relevant and appropriate outcomes. And I typically find that learning by example is the best way. So I'll walk through each individual element in the context of a JITAI that my team and I have developed, just by way of example. And so we'll talk about stumbling blocks, we'll talk about things that went well, and then hopefully I'll leave some time at the end for talking about that discussion. So the example, just-in-time intervention. So my team, myself and my team developed On Track. You'll see it has a bunch of different names. Diet Alert is one of them. Project Adapt is the newest one. It's taken a lot of iterations, but we developed a JITAI called On Track that provides in-the-moment support for individuals who are attempting to lose weight by predicting lapses from a diet that are likely to occur and sending personalized intervention tools to try and prevent these slips and ultimately boost weight losses. So those are the basic mechanics and the overarching purpose of this app. So we started with our design framework. We began working this problem by deciding on our distal outcome. So the distal outcome is the clinically meaningful goal that your JITAI is aiming to achieve. And quite simply, we wanted to achieve weight loss. There is still overweight and obesity is still a major public health concern. And we have these great behavioral obesity treatments that have been well tested and show really nice outcomes. But those outcomes only occur for some individuals some of the time. So there's improvement when it comes to weight losses in these treatments. There's room for improvement. And to improve weight losses in behavioral obesity treatments with just-in-time intervention, we need to develop or identify a short-term goal that acts as a mechanism for our distal outcome of weight loss. So this is what we consider to be our proximal outcome. It's the variable that we want to target on a moment-to-moment basis or a more moment-to-moment basis to ensure that an individual is on the path towards your distal outcome, towards long-term weight change. And in this regard, we identified dietary lapses as a proximal behavior that has been related to outcomes in obesity treatment. So we consider dietary lapses to be any instance where an individual is violating some of the dietary recommendations that we're giving them in weight loss treatments. The diet and weight loss treatments is really important. It's one of the core drivers of weight change. And we find that lapses from this diet are fairly frequent. So before we even set out in developing the JITAI, we learned about lapses. We learned that they occurred 3 to 4 times a week. They lead to an estimated 400 to 500 extra calorie intake a week. And no surprise, they impact weight change. So they are associated with weight loss outcomes across multiple studies, across different types of behavioral obesity treatments delivered in person and delivered via app. So they seem to be a really nice indicator of this distal outcome of weight change. And it's so important that we establish the proximal and distal outcome relationship. So because of the research, we identified lapses as our proximal outcome. The next decisions were which variables we were going to use to decide to intervene, so our tailoring variables. So these factors are marking these states of opportunity, states of receptivity, and when those interventions should happen. So when those interventions should happen are the decision points. What time interval, like when will we make a decision about intervention? Will we do it every hour? Will we do it when someone exhibits a certain behavior? There's lots of different options here for decision points. So to inform both of these factors, or both of these design principles, we primarily used ecological momentary assessment, which I'm sure most people on this seminar are familiar with, but it consists of basically daily repeated surveys on an individual's smartphone. Used to be paper, used to be a digital device, and now it's a smartphone. So we use this because they're better. First of all, EMA is better for studying lapses just in and of themselves, because lapses are difficult to measure in the lab. And they're also, if we measure them via retrospective self-report, like if someone says, hey, you have, how many lapses did you have last week? There's so many biases and so many things that get in the way of that. So we find that people reporting them in the moment is much, much better. We've also used EMA to previously find these different in the moment factors that can identify a heightened state of lapse risk. So again, before we even started developing the JITAI, we were studying EMA, we were studying lapses via EMA and studying different triggers for lapse via EMA. And it gets back at that concept of vulnerability. How do we know when someone is in a state where intervention is important? So we felt like using EMA here at the start of our building our JITAI was a good place to be because we had felt really comfortable with this work. So what we did is we began by sort of pooling the literature and identified 21 different triggers for lapsing. And we studied, what's the most predictive of lapses across, and we merged data from two studies. So we pulled the data and performed some variable selection procedures, and we whittled that down to 18. We eliminated like only a couple, but we whittled it down to 18 triggers that were predictive of lapses across individuals. So we actually built individual models for each person in the study to see how things, to make sure that across individuals, these were all predictive factors. And as a side note about these, so I underlined and starred some of these. I'm sure some of you are thinking, some of these can be measured via sensor. Some of these are able to be passively sensed at this point, including maybe even passive sensing of eating lapses or eating behaviors. But the only one that we passively sensed was time of day from the phone. And this is certainly, including sensor-based measurements in our just-in-time intervention, is certainly a direction of future work for us. But we really started with EMA because we had expertise in that area. We're already doing so many new things, so we didn't want to involve sensors just yet. Also, for context, some of this work actually started more in 2014, 2015. So at that time, sensor-based measurements and commercial wearables weren't exactly really popular as popular as they are now. But I find it interesting that as things evolve, what we could continue to do with this JITAI. But I do think it's worth mentioning that for feasibility purposes, we continue to use EMA in our work and hope to incorporate more sensor-based measurements as everything evolves, including as sensor-based research evolves. So we have here, we're filling in our boxes, right? We have the tailoring variables, we have psychological, contextual, and physiological triggers, all 18 of them. And then we have our decision point. So our decision point ended up just being, when can we collect information about our tailoring variables? So an individual completes an EMA rating, and that information gets stored and processed, and a decision about whether an intervention should be delivered can be made. So we just thought, great, completion of the EMA is the best decision point here. We know someone is available because they just completed a survey, and we'll have data fresh from the participant. On track, what we ended up deciding to do was having our EMA surveys occur 6 times a day. And that was decided based on lapse frequency and the changing nature of our tailoring variables. We felt like we could get 6 nice snapshots of someone's day. So that's the reason why we chose 6, and that continues to be feasible and acceptable to participants. So we keep kind of using that. So the next question we decided to answer was, how do these tailoring variables get used? How do we decide on when the state of vulnerability is and what intervention to be offering? So it's important to note that this can be complex or simple. You can really just also use a series of if-then statements, or you can go as complex up to machine learning. But the best way to start thinking about decision rules is to try, at the very least, to be guided by theory when possible. But at the time and now, there's not really great models of adherence behavior to guide in the moment predictions about lapses. So what we ended up doing is we ended up taking the data that we've gathered from previous projects, and we let those speak for themselves by using supervised machine learning. And so I'll talk about that process next. So for those of you who are well-versed in machine learning, this is definitely going to be an oversimplification, but for those of you who aren't, this will be a primer. So with supervised machine learning, we can let our data tell us when to intervene on someone. So when is an individual at risk for lapsing? So the steps of the machine learning process are straightforward, but certainly not easy. So we define our problem, we defined our predictors, right? Our predictors are our tailoring variables, those different 18 triggers of lapse that we think are going to help us identify that state of opportunity or vulnerability. And our outcome, which is dietary lapses, which we've defined already. And then we collect data. So what we did in our research is we actually collected data from 12 individuals who were undergoing an online or a mobile weight loss program. And we studied lapses and triggers for lapse from that particular weight loss program. And we did that over a period of 6 weeks. So they just completed EMA for 6 weeks straight. So that we could really get nice, rich data on lapses and their triggers. Then once all the data were collected, we trained a model. So we basically held out a subset, say like 4 weeks of someone's data to build a model, and then let that model learn the relationship among the predictors and the outcomes, and then use that model to generate predictions on the remainder of the data, the 2 weeks that you held out. And then you compare those to the actual participant responses to see how well the model did, if the model got it right or wrong. And you don't need to define your exact model a priori. There's a ton of different machine learning models, and you can optimize a ton of different parameters within those models. So you can run through this process as many times as you need. And so one of our whole big projects was just running different models to try to predict lapse as best we could and comparing and testing those different models. So what we ended up with is we ended up with the best model being a series of ensemble classifiers. And we made sure we were able to achieve 72% of correct predictions overall. So the prediction the model made compared to what actually happened, it got it 72% right. 70% of those predictions we were able to correctly classify a lapse, and 72% we were able to classify a non-lapse. And these numbers, depending on your area of machine learning, you may or may not have opinions about these numbers, but they're pretty good for behavioral work of using purely self-report to try to predict a self-reported behavior. And more importantly, the study showed, we ran some other analyses that I won't present here, but the study showed that our model for predicting lapses was statistically meaningful. So it was better than chance, and it was pragmatic. So it wasn't, we didn't use a deep learning approach. We used this model that was computationally feasible, and we knew we could put in a smartphone, or we knew we could incorporate into a smartphone app at some point. So now that we had done that work, we were able to, we know that we were able to intervene on lapses when an individual completes an EMA survey, and that a machine learning algorithm identifies that they're at risk based on their responses to the tailoring variables. So the final question then led to, what should we actually deliver in the moment? And what we decided to do is we decided to make a really massive library of interventions. So I think it ended up being like 157 different interventions. And we just kind of wrote every single intervention that we could think of, that we knew from, behavioral theory, and me and a team of psychologists all just kind of got to writing, and we made a giant library, and we used this to test out the just-in-time intervention as a proof of concept. So what you're seeing here on the screen is basically all of the talking that I've been doing sort of coming to life. So when people completed an EMA survey, their data was processed by the machine learning algorithm, and they were informed if they were at risk for lapsing. And then they were given a series of, they were told what their top risk factors were, and just given a random intervention from the pool of interventions from the taxonomy. And they could go through them as they liked. They could use 1 or 3 of them or none of them. So up until this point, we have a quote unquote complete JITAI. All the boxes are filled in. We have it developed. We're deciding, we have to test this thing. So I'll tell you a little bit now and move to our proof of concept work. So we had something to work with, and we just wanted to deploy it and see how it went with our participants and see what kind of data we were getting. So what we found, we conducted an open trial followed by an RCT. The open trial was, we deployed on track alongside the Weight Watchers program. So it's not the in-person meetings, if many of you are familiar with Weight Watchers. It's a mobile-based system where you can track your food, and they give you lots of resources for weight control. And it's pretty standard and well established. So we had decided to add on track to that. So in our open trial, 43 people used this for 8 weeks. And then we followed that up with an RCT where many more people used the app for 10 weeks. And we also included a Weight Watchers only condition. So a group that did not use on track. So it was Weight Watchers plus on track compared to Weight Watchers alone. And what you can see here in these two tables is that overall we were able to reduce lapses. So we found that our proximal outcome reduced over time, which is great news. We found that weight losses were comparable to what we would expect from an app-based treatment. And as you can see on the right here, the 4.7% weight loss was the weight loss achieved with on track versus the Weight Watchers alone, which was 2.6%, which is great. We saw that engagement with the app was good, especially since it's kind of a burden-intensive app. We asked people to complete a lot of surveys and to complete interventions. We liked the engagement we saw in the open trial. That did dip a little bit in the RCT because we took a little bit more of a hands-off, pragmatic approach. But as you can see, it didn't impact. Hopefully, it didn't impact weight losses too much. So this is to be expected when you're not checking in with people every week about their EMA response rates, in case anyone was wondering how that would go. And we know, and most importantly, we saw that our algorithm was working. So the algorithms guiding our decision rule were doing pretty well and holding up across samples as we would hope. So that gave us a lot of good confidence that we were moving in the right direction. And what we also did within our RCT, we also were so excited that we started optimizing on track. So within the RCT, the 181 people, we actually divided those who were assigned to on track into 2 different types of on track. The first type on track, which is called on track short here, was basically a shorter version of the on track EMA protocol. So where the people only saw 8 questions per EMA survey. We wanted to try to reduce the burden and keep it very low. However, only assessing 8 of the triggers at each EMA survey meant that there was a ton of missing data. So we wanted to kind of test our assumption that we couldn't. So originally we had thought, we can't possibly assess all 17 triggers at every survey. No way. We wanted to test that assumption. So what we did, this was my dissertation work, what we ended up doing was just randomly assigning people to a version where only 8 questions were asked at each survey prompt to a version where all 17 questions were asked at each survey prompt. And what we found was pretty interesting. If we start actually from the bottom, the algorithm accuracy improved as we got better data quality, as we reduced our missing data. We got better algorithm accuracy. The app predicted lapses with a higher level of sensitivity. But as we would have expected, it did decrease engagement. So people completed less EMA surveys. Interestingly, because there were more questions at each EMA survey, we still got more data in the on-track long condition, even though people completed fewer of the surveys overall. And interestingly enough, we thought this algorithm was so important, and we thought, oh my gosh, getting like 6 points higher or 6% higher in the sensitivity is going to mean so much. It did not do a lot for our behavioral outcomes. So weight change was roughly equivalent across groups, and lapse reduction was roughly equivalent across groups. So there's something to be said here for, you know, when we're adopting machine learning and when we're considering improvements in algorithms, you know, a cost benefit of how people are perceiving the accuracy of the app, and how much, you know, you have to pass that threshold with the accuracy of your algorithm before you get to the point where people are actually noticing that it's better. You know, I thought it was very important. It turned out we were measuring perceived helpfulness, and the participants did not notice a difference. So this research design, even though it was an RCT, and it's not what you came to hear this talk about, it was technically an optimization design, and it told us some important information that we were able to move forward with in the next iterations of On Track. But it wasn't the most efficient design, and there was something that was really nagging at us even after these two relatively big studies. And I'm sure you're all wondering by now, and I'm sure you all caught on to the question, but how do we really know that we prevented lapses? And did the testing thus far really actually answer the question of which intervention should we give to what person? My answer to that would be no. I felt unsatisfied with what we had done so far. So really our box, our table of our JITAI design actually looks like this, where the intervention option of what should we give to each individual at each time is kind of a big question mark. Looking back, I'm left with still a ton of questions. So does any intervention impact lapse? Up until this point, we only could measure if lapses decreased overall, but that was about it. That's a promising sign, but it's not a direct efficacy test. And we also wonder which interventions to deliver in moments of need, and if there are any other factors like time of day or individual difference factors that could be impacting this decision rule. So could our decision rule be more sophisticated? And I would argue that it could be, because right now, the decision rule is just when people are at risk, give them an intervention. So this is where I'll start shifting to talking about microrandomized trials. So I'm going to finish things off talking about the next trial that we designed to answer these research questions, and hopefully get us a little bit further along in this work. So to describe a microrandomized design, the simple explanation is that instead of randomizing an individual to a single treatment one time, as you would in an RCT, the MRT uses a sequential randomization to repeatedly randomize at specific instances based on a participant's current state or context, which is your decision point. So to walk you through it in the context of our JITAI, which I've been hopefully getting you really nice and familiar with, the decision point is when an EMA survey is completed and our well-validated machine learning algorithm determines that lapse risk is elevated. So we've got our decision point, the EMA survey is complete, the tailoring variables are put into our machine learning algorithm, and the algorithm makes a decision. It either says someone's at risk for lapse or they're not. And when they're not at risk for lapse, we don't give them an intervention. We don't say it, we don't let anything happen. But if they're at risk for lapse, that ends up being our decision point. So they can be randomized to an intervention option at that time. And remember before, they were just kind of given any old intervention from the whole library of interventions. Then we are able to measure directly what the proximal outcome is. So did they lapse in the survey after they got or in the next couple hours after they got that intervention? And what's unique about the MRT is that this process just happens over and over and over again. So the randomization process and the assessment of the outcome just continues to occur. And this happens over the course of the study, possibly hundreds of times. In our study, I think we calculated maybe like 100 times for each participant. So that in that way, in that regard, microrandomized trials are, you saw my transition. So they're super precise. To formally evaluate the intervention efficacy, we want to employ the design that allows us to examine immediate proximal effects. A traditional RCT design can't do this because it only assesses whether on average an intervention affected behavior. So we can't know, and this is the reason why our other studies were making me feel like we didn't have enough information from them. we can't know which interventions are being effective at a given moment, which is really crucial to understanding if your JITAI is working the way you think it's working, if it's data-driven, empirically supported. That's kind of the nuts and bolts of having the JITAI. They're also really efficient. So each participant can be randomized hundreds of times over the course of the study. This means you have power, tons of power. You don't require a lot of participants to be able to detect your effect of your proximal of the intervention on your proximal outcome. You can also answer several research questions in one study. When we were designing the study that I'll talk about on the next slide, I had to really pare down my research questions, but there's tons of sort of like secondary and exploratory research questions that you can answer with the design in and of itself. And then lastly, they're really informative on several levels. So in addition to just helping to develop a JITAI and also to provide the data necessary to even further personalize decision rules, it can also lead to the support of developing these new dynamic models of behavior change. So one of the things that can be really difficult about building these interventions and about behavioral interventions these days more broadly is that they're based on these outdated models that are very static. And the problem is we need these more dynamic models. So microrandomized trials are one tool that could help us achieve that. So in that regard, what we did is we actually were able to, based on some of the gaps we identified in our prior work, we wrote a proposal that was funded by NHLBI to accomplish the following aims. First, is any intervention at all effective in preventing lapse compared to no intervention? Second, are specific theory-driven interventions better at preventing lapse compared to a generic reminder or compared to no intervention at all? And lastly, can we use the data from this MRT and this JITAI to actually optimize and drive further personalization of intervention? So understanding not just when we should be intervening, when that state of vulnerability is, but are there certain contexts where certain interventions are better received? So this is our rebranding. So we're calling the study Project Adapt, and this is the newly designed Project Adapt app that we designed with in collaboration with Pillar Health. So participants in the trial, we're aiming to recruit 159 of them. They use this app for 6 months, which consists of much of the same as our pilot, so much of the same as you've seen before. So the daily EMA surveys will assess lapses and triggers for lapse. And these data will be put into a machine learning algorithm to predict the risk of lapse, and then an intervention will be delivered. In this case, instead of doing text-based interventions, we added videos and some more interactive tools to really, boost participant engagement. The big difference between our prior studies and this study is our randomization. So now we're randomizing to intervention in a very systematic way, not in a just pulling from the taxonomy or from the library way. So this is actually an example from my R output of our microrandomization code. So once the system is set up, it's actually quite simple. If you're an R programmer or if your statistician is an R programmer, it's really a simple function in R to repeatedly randomize. And this is just integrated into our code base. So when the machine learning model predicts something, this is what gets run next, essentially. And you can see here that it's basically just a random number generator, and we randomly assign in a particular, in weighted categories, the interventions to no intervention. And the interventions we chose also look a little bit different. So we intentionally actually use, so we have here no intervention, a generic reminder, just like, hey, you might be at risk for lapsing soon, enhanced education, self-efficacy, motivation, and self-regulation interventions. And we intentionally used these particular ones because they were based on a theoretical model of adherence behavior. So by basing everything on a tightly formed theoretical model, our hope is that we can say multiple things about the data coming from this MRT. So first of all, we'd like to say what types of intervention are most effective when and for whom. Like, for example, if you think about how this might look in practice. So let's say an intervention designed to foster motivation is effective at reducing lapses, but that effect is actually moderated by whether a person is in weight loss or weight loss maintenance, like towards the end of their time in treatment. We can determine that maybe motivation is an important momentary factor contributing to adherence, especially during no treatment follow-up. So towards the end of treatment or towards the end during weight loss maintenance. So that allows us to start again, like adding stuff into this model to make it more dynamic. So now we have a context of time that we can start to use to change this model. And we can also use these data to update our existing decision rules. So to create an algorithm that kind of dovetails with our existing model, just like the randomization algorithm, not too different from that, to decide which interventions for which people and in what contexts we should be delivering them. Instead of just everyone at risk gets an intervention no matter what. This will be the final aim of the study. So that third aim is really to use the MRT data to try to drive some of these more personalized decision rules. And I hope to have results maybe in a couple years. Maybe you'll have me back and I can present on the results of that MRT. But in closing here, I wanted to talk a little bit about, how where this puts us and how we can move forward. So the path to developing this JITAI, as I'm hoping I'm, communicating to all of you, it wasn't perfect or it wasn't completely linear. It actually led us to a lot of research questions that I could spend the next long while optimizing and iterating and just using the ADAPT app to answer really exciting research questions. So one option here is like keep optimizing. So we could do things like customize our tailoring variables by maybe having only certain tailoring variables assessed for certain people. We could incorporate passive sensors. So start to transition some of the measurement of our tailoring variables to other modes of assessment. We could learn more about availability. So right now our understanding of participant availability is very simple. It's just, if they complete a survey, it means they're available, but there might be other factors that could be contributing to availability or receptivity to intervention here. And that's something that, certainly would need an optimization study to understand if that were the case. And then lastly, continued iteration and molding of this decision rule to make it more and more personalized, to really make it feel like the app is getting to know a person better and better. So we can use increasingly more powerful models and exciting research tools to be able to do that. But, on the other end of things, we could build a career in optimization, but we could also think about using this JITAI, which is pretty much like full-fledged in not a final form, but in a nice form, to start actually conducting and understanding research, or to start conducting research like more broadly, and adding to weight management trials to see if we can use the JITAI to boost efficacy. So for example, at the end of this, we'll need to at some point do an RCT of, does the just-in-time intervention actually improve our distal outcome of weight change and possibly other distal health outcomes? Do we want to incorporate this into other optimization designs? So one of the things that I find the most fascinating is that the people at the forefront of this work, like Billy and Bonnie Spring and, Petra Klasnia, are starting to embed just-in-time interventions and embed MRTs into other optimization designs like MOST and SMART, and they're sort of creating this like multiple tiered series of optimizations. So, now that we have a system, a just-in-time system through Pillar Health, we can actually start to maybe actually embed this JITAI into other research designs. We can also use it to test new algorithms and as things advance, conduct simulation work. This is a great source of very rich data collection. So I'm sure the statistician that's on my project will have a field day with all the data coming from the microrandomized trial, and we'll probably be playing in that playground for a very long time. And similarly, we could start to adopt other different research frameworks like N of 1 studies that are becoming really popular in the area of personalized medicine. So I'll end with some just final thoughts, and then I'm hopeful that some of you will have questions for me or discussion. But I'm hoping that what I was able to illustrate today is that optimization and creating JITAIs is not a linear path. I've definitely gone forwards and backwards and sideways with this work, and I'll continue to do that because it's really interesting. And again, I'll remind you that describing my work was meant to be an illustration of possibilities, not a direct roadmap into any which way that we should be doing things. And finally, you should feel free to continue optimizing. There's an important need for this work, especially in technology where the pace of growth is outrageous. So don't be afraid to get to the end of your optimization study and do more optimization. And really making sure that you're sticking with your research questions, because in a world of possibilities where the tech is really fancy and the work is really exciting, it's very easy to get lost and to lose sight of your research questions. So stay grounded in that is something that I definitely learned along the way. And I feel like the best note to end on is to collaborate. So that's why I'm giving this talk, and that's why I'm excited about the Center for Digital Health. And new collaborations will always expand your expertise and sometimes make for some really exciting products. So that being said, I'd like to just acknowledge my funding sources and my collaborations to date and my programming team. And I will take questions whenever anybody's ready to give them.
This is awesome, Stephanie. Thank you so much. And I apologize for misstating a K instead of an R1, a huge mistake to make in pro. So kudos. I just want to correct the record. This was terrific. Congrats also on the terrific slides. They were beautiful, really well done, and a nice example, I think, for all of us of how to incorporate design into our research presentations, as well as into our actual interventions. So I'm going to start with a question and I'll open it up. So you mentioned N of 1 trials, and we've had a lot of debate internally to my team about the utility of N of 1 trials for behavioral interventions, particularly for things like, say, weight management, cognitive restructuring, right? So the idea behind the N of 1 is that you do the intervention and then you stop and you see if someone changes. But in theory, if the intervention works, it should have a durable effect. So I was interested in your thoughts about the N of 1s for these types of behavioral interventions like what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and one that I'm not sure that I'm 1000% qualified to answer, because I think the answer is that it depends on what the outcome is. So in my world, right, if I was to do an N of 1 study on lapses, I would feel really comfortable with that, because I think like new things come up all the time to throw us off our game. And I would just maybe challenge the notion of durability, and and we would hope that they're really durable, but I think that's a research question in and of itself, again, depending on the behavior, depending on the treatment. But the one thing, and I was talking to someone about this recently, about sort of defining the periods of when you're studying your outcome. So mine are very moment to moment, but these just-in-time interventions don't have to be right there in moments. So if you're worried about durability, I would argue that you could expand, the length of that N of 1 and expand the time that you're measuring your outcome on. The time scale, you can have a just-in-time intervention that gets delivered like every month. It doesn't feel just in time, but if that's the research question and that's what it is, then I would argue that that's what it should be. So I think, again, going back to the research question and what you know about the behavior you're studying is where the utility of N of 1 studies lie. I know that Eric Heckler would probably say everything can be N of 1, but you have to make sure it all lines up theoretically, would be my opinion.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm going to open it up for other folks to ask questions. Feel free to just kind of raise your hand and unmute yourself, or to type it in if you're feeling shy and want someone else to read the question for you.
I can ask a question. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Tovar. I'm a faculty in the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences at URI. Thank you so much for a really, really great talk. And I guess my first question, somewhat related to Megan's question on sort of sustainability. As we know, with weight loss trials over time, participants go right back to their initial weight right after 6 months. So I was going to ask you to comment on how just-in-time interventions and how they might impact sustainability of behavior change. But I think you sort of answered that already, but I didn't know if you have anything else to comment, not the N of 1, but.
Yeah, I think I thought about that a lot. And there's a couple of things, including work that I'm doing with Dr. Graham Thomas, really focusing on developing a just-in-time tool, a support tool for weight maintenance in particular. So that's one of the questions that I have, and I sort of touched on this during the presentation about context and time and treatment being an important context. And so one idea would be like, can we just deliver support when someone is starting on that upward trajectory of weight regain? And can we continue to maybe passively monitor them, or maybe do less frequent EMA to just keep tabs on them and do that just-in-time support in a much different way during the maintenance period than during the weight loss period. But again, that's kind of why I love EMA, and I'm going to include it in my work probably for a long time coming. But the movement to passive sensing, and the great thing about it for less frequent EMA is that we can monitor people for much longer in a less obtrusive way. So that's kind of where I think this can come into the sustainability or the durability of weight management practices, where for typical treatments, I mean, research-based treatments, we would do like a year. They don't even last that long in normal practice, I think. But after a year, 2 years, 3 years, like, can we get a tool that will continue to update and iterate? That would be my goal as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I see that Chris Hughes has raised his hand.
So I guess in that sort of that same vein of including more passive sensing, I know you had mentioned that the machine learning algorithms you used were primarily supervised.
Mm-hmm.
And so with switching to passive sensing, passively collected data, do you see a need to shift into unsupervised, or how do you envision that happening in terms of the algorithm working the back end of it?
That's a great question. So I actually supervised a student who started incorporating passive sensing into the algorithm that we already have, into the supervised algorithm. It depends on the way that we're going to structure the data. So let's say if I'm going to take something from Fitbit and it's just going to have like the hours of sleep per night, and I'm just replacing like hours of sleep per night measured via Fitbit versus, then I would probably say supervised, still very computationally feasible. We already have the algorithms. Let's do that. But you raise a point, and I'm assuming you're talking more in the realm of like digital phenotyping and what unsupervised methods can do in that regard. And that's something I'm really interested in, but but as you can see, the work hasn't quite caught up to my interest in that yet. So I just actually put in a proposal where we'll be using some unsupervised methods to learn more about mechanisms of lapse behavior. So that's certainly where we're headed. Forecasted that.
Yeah, and I think that's right on the cutting edge. I think that the time series data in terms of unsupervised learning has been outperformed by most models up until like December. So right on the cusp. You're good timing.
Yeah. And it's an exciting thing to start doing. And like what's really cool about these studies is you could do both. Like you could collect the data and then kind of just play around in it. And as a behavioral scientist, I know it's weird to say, but I love working with data scientists to do that. It's so fun to just sort of sit at the crossroads of it. So.
I have another question if there are other questions. Okay, I don't want to hog time, but so okay, I was wondering what the demographics of your target population was, and also thinking about sort of your machine learning algorithms and the data that inform those. Just again, sort of thinking about health disparities and wondering if you could sort of comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, so health disparities is like a sort of is an area where I would love to push this into that I haven't been able to yet, but our sample is primarily female. The breakdown has historically been like about 75%, 70 to 75% white. We're trying to like get that number down, which begs the question of like our algorithms are probably built for like white women for the most part. And they account, we put in individual difference factors like gender and race and ethnicity and things like that. So it's not just the momentary factors that go into the model, it's the individual difference factors as well. So we can start to try to tailor with that regard in that regard. But it's certainly one of the moderators that I have planned for the next iteration of this, of the MRTs. I'm well aware of the terrible bias that occurs in machine learning of all things towards racial health and racial disparities. So that's again one of the things that has been on my mind as of late. And I don't know, maybe we can collaborate on a proposal to help address it because that's what I want to do.
Thanks, Stephanie. Great.
And I'm going to ask one follow-up question, and then I will also call people's attention to John Batenia, our program director, just put in the chat a little eval if you guys wouldn't mind filling out, that would be great. But Stephanie, my last question is around that kind of micro tailoring. That one of the things that our group and others have struggled with is that we say, we're going to tailor based off of 10 different variables. And then when you go and you actually write the messages and user test them, a lot of them end up being the same. And so although you can predict that people will have slightly different responses based on this micro tailoring, the actual intervention content itself becomes a little more difficult to change. So I'd be interested in hearing how you've handled that from the intervention design perspective.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that even though you try to have all of these different categories of like a certain type of person at a certain time based on certain contexts, the interventions start to sort of bleed together.
Exactly. That like an intervention for a girl versus a boy who's experiencing a similar emotional state. What's really,
it's really tricky. So right now where I'm at with this is that's kind of the reason why I actually pared down. So we had that like big giant taxonomy of 150 interventions, and we pared it down to, in this microrandomized trial, like 17 interventions that we are, 16 of them, like a couple for each theoretical construct of motivation, self-efficacy. Because my thought is that you're right, like they do kind of all tend to bleed together because they're all based on like relatively straightforward behavioral principles that, and my thought would be, and my question is in my work, is it really the content that needs to be tailored, or is it like the timing, or the, which self-efficacy intervention needs to be delivered, if it's a boy versus a girl, or if it's during treatment or during follow-up. I don't know like how tailored we can get and how precise that micro micro delivery can be. And I don't know how much it needs to be. So I think I don't have a good answer for you. That's part of my research question. And why I designed it exactly the way I did is so that I could get this sense, and like that way we have this bank, this general bank that we could start to tailor from if the research tells us we need it. So I'm trying to let the data speak for themselves here before I go into like a whole bunch of intervention development and then come out being like, they're all the same.
I love it. Well, we have years of learning from you. Congratulations on the grant and good luck on the mission. And thank you for presenting to us today. It's an absolute joy. Definitely expanded a lot of thoughts and minds. And look forward to working with you going forwards. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you to everybody. See you guys all soon. Bye-bye. Oh, quickly to everyone, as you guys log off, also we have a